A bride for the ruthless Kingpin. Caterina Moretti had been promised since birth, a bride with no voice in the war her family was waging. But when she was delivered to her husband-to-be, she expected cruelty, not silence. Enzo Vitali studied her like she was something to be understood, not broken. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, edged with something dangerous. "I didn't want a wife," he murmured. "But now that you're mine, I don't plan on letting you go." Chapter 1. The Unveiling of a Promise. The heavy brocade curtains of the palazzo window were drawn, but even they couldn't entirely block out the relentless Neapolitan sun. Caterina Moretti stood bathed in the filtered light, the dust motes dancing around her like tiny, ephemeral spirits. She smoothed a hand down the silk of her ivory gown, a dress chosen not for its beauty, but for its symbolism. Virginity. Submission. A silent promise. A promise she hadn't made, but one that had been etched onto her soul since her first breath. She was 58, yet today, she felt like the terrified girl of 18 she'd never truly been allowed to be. Life had been a series of carefully orchestrated performances, each one designed to mold her into the perfect Donna Dianora, a woman of honor, a woman of silence, a woman of obedience. Her first marriage, to the aging but powerful Don Salvatore Rossi, had been a masterclass in this art. 20 years of smiles that never reached her eyes, of quiet acquiescence, of burying her own desires so deep they'd almost withered and died. Salvatore had been cruel, not with fists, but with the casual disregard of a man who saw women as possessions, not people. He'd died 5 years ago, leaving her with a vast fortune, a hollow heart, and a freedom she hadn't known how to wield. Until now. Now, she was being offered up again, a pawn in a game far older and more dangerous than she could comprehend. The Moretti family, her family, and the Vitali family, locked in a bitter feud that stretched back generations, had decided on a truce. And she, Caterina Moretti Rossi, was the price. The bride offered to seal the peace. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, despite the oppressive heat of the room. Enzo Vitali. The name itself was a whispered legend, a blend of fear and fascination. The current capo of the Vitali family, he was known for his ruthlessness, his intelligence, and his unnervingly quiet demeanor. He was a man who commanded respect through presence, not bombast. A man who, they said, could kill with a glance. And he was 20 years her junior. Caterina closed her eyes, picturing the few stolen glimpses she'd had of him over the years at various family gatherings, heavily guarded, carefully controlled events where the simmering tension between the Morettis and Vitalis was palpable, even to the uninitiated. He was strikingly handsome, in a way that was almost unsettling. Dark, intense eyes that seemed to see everything, a strong jawline, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. He moved with a controlled grace, a predator's stillness that spoke of power held tightly in check. A knock on the heavy oak door startled her. Her cousin, Isabella, entered, her face a mask of forced cheerfulness. Isabella, with her bright, bubbly personality, was everything Caterina was not. "Cara," Isabella said, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. "He's here. They're waiting for you in the drawing room." Caterina nodded, her throat tight. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from afar, a puppet being maneuvered onto a stage. She followed Isabella down the grand staircase, the marble cool beneath her slippered feet. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and old money, a suffocating combination that made her want to gasp for fresh air. The drawing room was a cavernous space, filled with antique furniture, priceless paintings, and the watchful eyes of men who had built their lives on secrets and violence. Her brothers, Marco and Alessandro, stood stiffly by the fireplace, their faces grim. They had never shown her much affection, their lives consumed by the business of the famiglia. She was simply a tool to them, a means to an end. And then she saw him. Enzo Vitali stood by the window, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. He was even more imposing up close. The cut of his dark suit emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. He turned as she entered, and their eyes met. Katerina had expected coldness, perhaps even disdain. What she saw instead was curiosity. His dark eyes, framed by thick, black lashes, studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply observed, like a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was her uncle, the current head of the Moretti family, old Don Antonio, who finally broke it. "Katerina," he said, his voice raspy with age and the weight of his responsibilities, "this is Enzo Vitali, your husband-to-be." Enzo inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not deference. "Signora Rossi," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent an unexpected shiver through her. It was a voice that could soothe or command, and she sensed, instinctively, that it was rarely used for the former. He stepped closer, and she could smell his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, something wilder, that hinted at the danger that lay beneath the surface. He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His fingers were long and strong, calloused in places, a testament to a life that was far removed from the pampered existence she had known. He raised her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. The brush of his lips against her skin was fleeting, barely there, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a gesture of respect, yes, but there was something else there too. A possessiveness. A claim. "I didn't want a wife," he murmured, his voice so low that only she could hear. The words were stark, unexpected, a brutal honesty that stripped away the pretense of the situation. He released her hand, his eyes still locked on hers. "But now that you're mine," he continued, the words edged with something dangerous, something that made her heart pound against her ribs, "I don't plan on letting you go." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Katerina felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in decades. Fear, yes, but also something else. A spark of defiance. A glimmer of hope. A terrifying, exhilarating sense of the unknown. She was being handed over, a prize in a war she didn't understand, but his words, his touch, his gaze, they had awakened something within her. Something that refused to be silent. Something that, perhaps, was finally ready to fight. She looked up at him, and for first time, she didn't break the gaze. There was a fire there, a danger. She was stepping directly into the flames, but what choice did she have? This had always been her destiny, and yet, in his gaze, it felt entirely new. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past, Echoes of the Future. The drive to the Vitali estate was a blur of winding coastal roads and blurred city lights. Katerina sat in the back of the sleek, black car, Enzo beside her, a silent, watchful presence. The air inside the vehicle was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable energy that crackled between them. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the Moretti Palazzo, and she hadn't dared to break the silence. She stole glances at him, studying his profile in the dim light. The strong line of his jaw, the slight curve of his nose, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but she sensed a simmering intensity beneath his calm exterior. He exuded a quiet power, a dangerous allure that both frightened and fascinated her. She wondered about his life, about the forces that had shaped him into the man he was. The weight of the Vitali legacy, the burden of leadership, the constant threat of violence that permeated their world. She knew so little about him, yet she was bound to him, her future inextricably linked to his. The car finally pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate, adorned with the Vitali family crest, a snarling wolf's head, encircled by a laurel wreath. The gates swung open silently, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with ancient cypress trees. The estate itself was a sprawling, imposing structure, built of pale stone that glowed faintly in the moonlight. It was a fortress, a palace, a symbol of the Vitali family's power and influence. As they stepped out of the car, Katerina was struck by the silence. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of the leaves in the night breeze and the distant crash of waves against the shore. It was a stark contrast to the bustling, chaotic energy of the Moretti household. Enzo led her through a series of grand, echoing hallways, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and something indefinable that hinted at generations of secrets and untold stories. He finally stopped in front of a pair of massive, carved wooden doors. "This is your suite," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He pushed the doors open, revealing a bedroom that was both opulent and strangely impersonal. It was furnished with antique furniture, a large four-poster bed draped in silk and velvet, and a fireplace that dominated one wall. There were fresh flowers on the bedside table, a delicate touch that seemed out of place in this cold, imposing environment. Katerina stepped inside, feeling a sense of unease settle over her. This was to be her new home, her prison, her sanctuary, she wasn't sure which. Enzo followed her into the room, closing the doors behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut seemed to echo the finality of her situation. She was alone with him, in his domain, completely at his mercy. He turned to face her, his dark eyes studying her with that same unsettling intensity she'd seen earlier. "You will be safe here," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "No one will harm you." It was a statement, not a reassurance. She nodded, her throat tight. "I understand." He continued to observe her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "My father, he believed in tradition. He believed in alliances. He believed in control." Katerina sensed a hidden meaning in his words, a subtle critique of the arrangement that had brought them together. She wondered if he resented her, resented the fact that he had been forced into this marriage, just as she had. "I am not my father," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I will not force you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. She looked up at him, searching his eyes for any hint of deception, any sign of the cruelty she had expected. She saw only weariness. And something else. A flicker of vulnerability, quickly masked, but it was there. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was unexpected, a stark contrast to his earlier pronouncements. It sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to desire. "Sleep," he said, his voice husky. He withdrew his hand, the absence of his touch leaving her skin feeling strangely cold. "We will talk more in the morning." He turned and walked towards the door, his movements fluid and graceful. He paused at the threshold, his back to her. "Katerina," he said, his voice low and resonant, This life, it is not easy. There are shadows. There are dangers. But I will protect you. That I promise." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the silence of the room, his words echoing in her mind. Shadows. Dangers. Protection. She was surrounded by them, enveloped by them, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life had changed forever. She was the capo's bride, and the shadows of the past were already reaching out to claim her, threatening to engulf her in a world she was only beginning to understand. But his last words, a promise whispered in the stillness, lingered. A fragile hope in the looming darkness. Chapter 3. A Cage of Gilded Iron. The morning light streamed through the sheer curtains, painting the room in a soft, ethereal glow. Katerina awoke slowly, her mind still clouded with the remnants of unsettling dreams. She lay in the vast, unfamiliar bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin, and listened to the silence of the house. It was a different kind of silence than she was used to, a silence born not of emptiness, but of watchful waiting. She rose and dressed, choosing a simple, dark blue dress from the wardrobe that had been mysteriously filled with clothes in her size. They were elegant, expensive, but understated, a reflection of the Vitali aesthetic. She felt like an imposter, wearing these clothes, living in this house, playing the role of Enzo Vitali's wife. She ventured out of her suite, navigating the labyrinthine hallways with a growing sense of unease. The house was eerily quiet, the only sounds her own footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She passed numerous closed doors, each one a mystery, a potential hiding place for secrets. She finally found her way to a large, sun-drenched dining room, where a long, polished table was set for breakfast. Enzo was already seated at the head of the table, a newspaper spread out in front of him, a cup of espresso at his elbow. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes assessing her with that familiar intensity. "Good morning," he said, his voice neutral. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please sit." She obeyed, feeling a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The table was laden with food, fresh fruit, pastries, cheeses, meats, a feast that seemed excessive for just the two of them. A silent servant, a woman with a weathered face and watchful eyes, poured her coffee. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the clinking of silverware against china the only sound. Katerina picked at her food, her appetite non-existent. She felt his gaze on her, and it made her skin prickle. "Did you sleep well?" he asked finally, his voice breaking the silence. "Yes," she lied. She had tossed and turned for hours, haunted by images of his face, his words, the chilling weight of her new reality. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "This house, it can be overwhelming," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "It has been in my family for generations. There is a lot of history here." She sensed a double meaning in his words. History, secrets, bloodshed. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air. I don't know much about your family," she said, her voice hesitant. He looked at her, a flicker of something surprise? Amusement? Crossing his face. "And you want to know?" She nodded, her curiosity overcoming her fear. She needed to understand him, to understand the world she had been thrust into. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "The Vitalis," he said, "have always been protectors. Of our family, of our territory, of our way of life." He spoke in generalities, avoiding the specifics, the brutal realities of their existence. She knew, of course, about the Omerta, the code of silence that governed their world. She knew that she would never be privy to the inner workings of the famiglia, the decisions made in the shadows, the violence that was an inevitable part of their lives. "And your father?" she asked, pushing the boundaries, testing the limits of his openness. His face hardened, his eyes darkening. "My father was a strong man," he said, his voice tight. "He did what he had to do to protect his family. He believed in respect and fear." She sensed a deep-seated conflict within him, a struggle between loyalty to his father's legacy and a desire to forge his own path. She wondered if that was why he had been so reluctant to marry her, why he had spoken of not wanting a wife. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you believe in the same things?" He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "I believe in survival," he said, his voice low and resonant. "I believe in protecting what is mine. And I believe in choice." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Choice. Something she had never had. Something he seemed to be offering her, in his own, guarded way. He stood up abruptly, breaking the spell. "I have business to attend to," he said. "You are free to explore the house, the grounds. There are servants, they will attend to your needs." He hesitated, then added, "There is a garden at the back of the house. It was my mother's. She found peace there." He turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Katerina sat there for a long moment, his words, his unspoken emotions, swirling around her. He was a puzzle, a contradiction, a man of violence who spoke of choice, a man of darkness who offered her a glimpse of light. The garden, his mother's sanctuary, a place of peace. She decided to seek it out, hoping to find some solace, some understanding, in this gilded cage that was now her home. The cage was beautiful, crafted with care, but it was still a cage. Yet, the mention of choice, a concept so foreign, gave the bars a slightly less daunting appearance. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a key hidden somewhere within these walls. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Midnight Garden. The garden was a hidden oasis, tucked away behind the imposing walls of the Vitali estate. It was a riot of color and fragrance, a vibrant tapestry of roses, jasmine, and bougainvillea, their scents mingling with the salty tang of the sea air. A stone fountain gurgled softly in the center, its water sparkling in the sunlight. It was a world away from the cold, formal grandeur of the house, a place of beauty and tranquility that seemed to belong to a different era. Katerina wandered through the winding paths, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of life. She touched the velvety petals of a blood-red rose, its fragrance intoxicating. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to absorb the peace of the place, to let it soothe her troubled spirit. She found a small, secluded bench, nestled beneath the shade of a sprawling olive tree. She sat down, gazing out at the breathtaking view of the Mediterranean Sea. The water was a deep, shimmering blue, stretching out to the horizon, where it met the sky in a hazy embrace. She thought of Enzo, of his enigmatic words, his guarded emotions. She was beginning to understand that he was a man trapped by his own legacy, burdened by the expectations of his family, the demands of his position. He was a prisoner in his own way, just as she was. She spent the afternoon in the garden, losing herself in the beauty of her surroundings. She read a book she found in the small library off the main hall, a collection of Italian poetry, its words resonating with her own longing for freedom, for love, for a life lived on her own terms. As dusk began to fall, she heard a sound behind her, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. She turned, expecting to see one of the servants. Instead, it was Enzo. He stood at the edge of the garden, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He looked different somehow. Less guarded, less imposing. He was wearing a simple white shirt, open at the collar, and dark trousers. He looked more like a man than a capo. "I didn't know you were here," she said, her voice slightly breathless. He smiled, a rare, fleeting smile that transformed his face. "I come here sometimes," he said. "It helps me think." He walked towards her, his movements fluid and graceful. He sat down beside her on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "It's beautiful," she said, gesturing to the garden. "Your mother, she must have loved it." He nodded, his gaze softening.
"She did.
She spent hours here, tending to her flowers. She said it was the only place where she felt free." Katerina sensed a deep sadness in his voice, a lingering grief for the loss of his mother. She wondered about her, about the woman who had brought this complex, dangerous man into the world. What was she like? She asked, her voice gentle. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to share this intimate part of his life with her. "She was kind," he said finally, his voice low and husky. "Gentle. She didn't belong in this world. The world of the famiglia. She hated the violence, the secrets, the betrayals." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She died when I was young."
"À car accident?"
they said. Katerina heard the unspoken question in his voice, the doubt that lingered beneath the surface. She knew that in their world, nothing was ever as it seemed. Accidents could be arranged, truths could be buried, enemies could be silenced. "You don't believe it was an accident?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "I don't know. There were rumors, whispers, but no proof." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain that was both raw and profound. "My father, he never spoke of it. He shut down any inquiries. He said it was better not to know." Katerina reached out and touched his hand, a spontaneous gesture of comfort. His skin was warm, rough against hers. He looked at her, his eyes surprised, then something else. A flicker of gratitude, of connection. He didn't pull away. Instead, he intertwined his fingers with hers, his grip gentle but firm. They sat there in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the waves and the chirping of crickets in the gathering darkness. "Katerina," he said, his voice husky, I know this is not the life you wanted. I know you were forced into this. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. He understood. He saw her, not as a pawn, not as a possession, but as a person, with her own hopes, her own fears, her own desires. "But I will try," he continued, his voice sincere. "I will try to make it bearable. I will try to protect you, not just from outside threats, but for myself." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that she had never seen before. He was offering her more than just protection. He was offering her respect,
Trust.
the possibility of something more. The moon had risen, casting a silvery glow over the garden. It was a night for secrets, for whispered confessions, for fragile connections forged in the darkness. And in that moment, Katerina felt a shift within her, a thawing of the ice that had encased her heart for so long. She was still afraid, still uncertain, but she was no longer alone. And in the shared silence, in the gentle pressure of his hand in hers, she found a glimmer of hope, a whisper of a promise that perhaps, just perhaps, this cage of gilded iron could become something more. Something beautiful. Something real. Something that felt a great deal like a second chance. She leaned in slightly, unknowingly, and his scent filled her senses. The sandalwood, the musk, the hint of danger, they were no longer frightening, but alluring. Chapter 5. The Serpent's Dance. The following weeks settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Katerina explored the vast Vitali estate, discovering hidden courtyards, dusty libraries, and rooms filled with antique furniture that whispered of generations past. She spent hours in the garden, finding solace in the beauty and tranquility of her surroundings. She began to learn the routines of the household, the comings and goings of the servants, the silent, watchful presence of Enzo's men. Enzo himself remained an enigma. He was often absent, consumed by the business of the famiglia, the details of which remained shrouded in secrecy. When he was present, he was polite, respectful, even attentive. He would join her for dinner, engaging in carefully constructed conversations, avoiding any mention of his work, of the violence that was an inherent part of his life. But there were moments, fleeting glimpses, when she saw beneath the surface, when she caught a flicker of the raw power, the dangerous intensity that he kept so tightly controlled. A sudden hardening of his gaze, a subtle shift in his posture, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. These moments reminded her that he was a capo, a man who commanded respect and fear, a man who was capable of anything. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, a servant approached Enzo, his face pale and strained. He whispered something in Enzo's ear, his voice urgent. Enzo's expression changed instantly, his eyes darkening, his body tensing. He excused himself abruptly, leaving Katerina alone at the table, her heart pounding with a sudden, nameless fear. She waited for hours, pacing restlessly in her suite, her imagination conjuring up all sorts of horrific scenarios. She had no idea what was happening, what crisis had called him away, but she knew, instinctively, that it was something dangerous, something that threatened the fragile peace of their existence. It was after midnight when he finally returned. He entered her suite without knocking, his face etched with exhaustion, and something else, something that looked like anger, barely suppressed. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the window, staring out at the darkness, his hands clenched into fists. He seemed to be struggling to control his emotions, to regain the composure that was so essential to his persona. "There was a problem," he said finally, his voice tight. "A disagreement. With another family." She knew he was downplaying the situation, sanitizing the brutal reality of their world. A disagreement. It was a euphemism for violence, for bloodshed, for the constant threat of war that hung over them like a dark cloud. Is everyone all right?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed surprised by her concern, as if he hadn't expected her to care. "Yes," he said, his voice softening slightly. "No one on our side was seriously hurt." She let out a sigh of relief, her body relaxing slightly. She realized, with a jolt, that she had been genuinely worried about him, about his safety. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, this concern for a man who was, in many ways, a stranger to her. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense. You were worried, he said, his voice low and husky. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. The truth was there, in her eyes, in the tremor of her hands. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. The touch was unexpected, electric. It sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and desire. Katerina, he said, his voice a whisper, this life, it is not for the faint of heart. There will be more nights like this. More dangers. More uncertainties. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and something else. A growing fascination, a dangerous attraction to this man who was both her captor and her protector. I know, she said, her voice trembling. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. But I will keep my promise, he said, his voice husky. I will protect you. Always. His lips brushed against hers, a fleeting, tentative touch, barely there. It was a kiss, but not a kiss. A promise, but not a commitment. A spark, but not yet a flame. It ended as quickly as it began. He stepped back, his gaze still locked on hers. Go to sleep, he ordered softly. You need your rest. He turned and walked towards the door, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding, her senses reeling. The brief contact had ignited something within her, a longing that had been dormant for so long, a desire that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She knew that she was dancing with a serpent, playing a dangerous game, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. She was drawn to him, to his power, to his vulnerability, to the promise of something more that shimmered just beneath the surface. The serpent had begun its dance, and she, willingly or not, was caught in its coils. The question was, would she be consumed, or would she find a way to tame the beast? The night was not over, a lingering unease remained. Chapter 6. Broken Vows, Hidden Truths. The fragile peace that had settled over the Vitali household was shattered a few days later by the arrival of a visitor. Katerina was in the garden, tending to the roses, when she heard the sound of a car approaching. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and saw a sleek, silver car pull up to the front of the house. A woman emerged from the car, her movements confident and graceful. She was strikingly beautiful, with long, dark hair, fiery eyes, and a figure that was both elegant and alluring. She was dressed in a designer suit that screamed power and wealth. Katerina recognized her instantly. Isabella Rossi, Salvatore Rossi's niece, from Katerina's first marriage, and a woman known for her ambition and ruthlessness. Katerina felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. Isabella had always been difficult. She had resented Katerina's marriage to her uncle, seeing her as an obstacle to her own ambitions. She had made no secret of her disdain, her jealousy, her desire to see Katerina removed from the picture. Isabella walked towards the house, her heels clicking on the stone pathway. She spotted Katerina in the garden and stopped, a smirk playing on her lips. Katerina, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How surprising to find you here, in the Vitali garden, playing the happy wife. Katerina straightened up, meeting Isabella's gaze with a newfound defiance. She was no longer the timid, submissive woman she had been during her first marriage. She had found a strength within herself, a resilience that she hadn't known she possessed. Isabella, she said, her voice calm and controlled. What brings you here? Isabella laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Oh, I just came to check on you. To see how you were adjusting to your new life. Her eyes scanned Katerina's simple dress, her work-worn hands, a hint of disdain in her expression. It seems Enzo is keeping you busy, keeping you grounded. Katerina refused to be baited. She knew that Isabella was trying to provoke her, to goad her into revealing some weakness, some vulnerability. I am content, she said, her voice steady. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had found a measure of peace in the garden, in the quiet moments with Enzo, in the slow, tentative unfolding of their relationship. Isabella's smile widened, a predatory gleam in her eyes.
Content?
Oh, I doubt that, Katerina. You were always ambitious. You always wanted more. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I hear things, Katerina. Whispers. Rumors. About Enzo. About his business. About his past. Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Isabella was dangerous, that she was capable of anything. She had a network of informants, a web of connections that stretched throughout the underworld. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Isabella laughed again, a mocking sound. Oh, I think you do. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Enzo Vitali is not the honorable man you think he is. He has secrets.
Dark secrets.
Secrets that could destroy him. She paused, her eyes locking on Katerina's. And destroy you. Katerina felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew that Isabella was telling the truth, at least in part. Enzo had secrets. She had sensed them from the beginning. But she had also seen his vulnerability, his kindness, his desire to protect her. I don't believe you, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isabella smiled, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. You will. In time. You will. And when you do, you will come to me. Because I can help you. I can protect you. From him. She turned and walked away, her movements fluid and graceful, leaving Katerina standing there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. Isabella's words had planted a seed of doubt, a whisper of suspicion that threatened to erode the fragile trust she had begun to build with Enzo. She knew that she should dismiss Isabella's accusations, that she should trust her own instincts, her own observations. But the seed had been planted, and it was beginning to grow, feeding on her fears, her insecurities, her own lingering doubts. That evening, Enzo was unusually quiet during dinner. He seemed preoccupied, distant, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Katerina tried to engage him in conversation, but he responded with monosyllabic answers, his mind clearly elsewhere. After dinner, he excused himself, saying he had work to do. Katerina watched him go, her heart heavy, with a growing sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Isabella's words had struck a chord, that there were hidden truths lurking beneath the surface of their carefully constructed reality. She decided to confront him. She needed to know the truth, to understand the secrets that he was keeping from her. She found him in his study, a dimly lit room filled with books and papers. He was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, his body slumped with exhaustion. She closed the door behind her, the sound echoing in the silence. He looked up, his eyes startled, then guarded. Katerina, he said, his voice weary. What is it? She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. Isabella came to see me today, she said, her voice trembling slightly. His face hardened, his eyes darkening. Isabella? What did she want? She said things, Katerina continued, her voice hesitant.
About you.
About your past. She said you have secrets.
Dark secrets.
He didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the darkness. He seemed to be wrestling with his own demons, struggling to decide what to reveal, what to conceal. Isabella is a liar, he said finally, his voice tight. She is jealous. She wants what you have. Katerina shook her head. I don't think so, Enzo. I think she knows something. Something you're not telling me. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. There are things you don't need to know, he said, his voice low and rough. Things that are better left buried. But I am your wife, she said, her voice rising. I deserve to know the truth. I deserve to know who you really are. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her determination. Very well, he said finally, his voice resigned. You want the truth? I will tell you the truth. But be warned, Katerina. The truth is not always pretty. The truth can be dangerous. The truth will change everything. He took a deep breath. My father's death, it wasn't natural. And my mother's was even worse. And I thought I was the cause. The confession hung in the air, heavy and filled with something far more than regret. Chapter 7. The Weight of Silence. Enzo's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a shroud thrown over the room. Katerina stared at him, her mind struggling to process the enormity of his confession. His father's death, his mother's, and he, the cause? It was too much to comprehend, too horrific to contemplate. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice trembling. He turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the darkened window. He seemed to be lost in the past, reliving the events that had shaped him, the traumas that had left him scarred and broken. My father, he began, his voice low and rough. He was a powerful man, a ruthless man. He had enemies, many enemies. He paused, his hands clenching into fists. He made deals. He broke rules. He crossed lines. He did things, unspeakable things. To protect the famiglia.
To protect me.
Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. She knew, of course, about the violence that was inherent in their world, the brutal realities of their existence. But to hear it spoken aloud, to hear Enzo admit to his father's sins, it was chilling. One of those deals, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, involved a rival family. The Salerno family. They were ambitious. They wanted what we had. My father, he refused to yield. He refused to compromise. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a pain that was both raw and profound. He made an enemy of Don Carlo Salerno. A powerful, dangerous enemy. An enemy who sought revenge. Katerina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew where this was leading. She could feel it in the chilling air of the room, in the tremor of his voice. My father, Enzo continued, his voice breaking, he was ambushed.
Shot.
In broad daylight. They made it look like a robbery. But it was Salerno. I know it was. He paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And my mother, she witnessed it. She saw everything. She tried to help him. But it was too late. Katerina reached out and touched his arm, a spontaneous gesture of comfort. His skin was cold, clammy. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a haunted expression. Salerno, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't let her live. She was a witness. She could expose him. He ordered her killed. He closed his eyes, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. They made it look like a car accident, just like they said. But it was murder. Cold-blooded murder. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking on Katerina's. And I was the reason, he said, his voice choked with guilt. I was careless. I was young. I trusted someone I shouldn't have. I revealed information. Information that Salerno used. To plan the ambush. To kill my parents. Katerina stared at him, her heart aching for the pain he was enduring. She understood now. The weight of his guilt. The burden of his responsibility. The darkness that haunted him. Enzo, she said, her voice gentle, it wasn't your fault. You were a child. You couldn't have known. He shook his head, his eyes filled with self-loathing. I should have known. I should have been more careful. I should have protected them. He turned away from her, his body racked with sobs. Katerina had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so broken. The mask of the capo had slipped, revealing the wounded, grieving man beneath. She went to him, wrapping her arms around him, holding him close. He clung to her, his body shaking, his tears soaking her dress. She held him, whispering words of comfort, of reassurance, of love. It was a love born of compassion, of understanding, of a shared pain that transcended their circumstances. It was a love that had grown slowly, tentatively, in the shadows of their world, nurtured by shared moments of silence, of fleeting touches, of unspoken emotions. They stayed like that for a long time, locked in an embrace, their tears mingling, their hearts beating as one. The weight of his silence, the burden of his secrets, had been lifted, at least for a moment. And in that shared vulnerability, in that raw, unfiltered emotion, a new bond was forged, a deeper connection that transcended the boundaries of their arranged marriage, the constraints of their world. The truth had been revealed, and it was painful, it was devastating, but it was also liberating. It had stripped away the pretense, the artifice, the carefully constructed facades that had separated them. It had brought them together, in a way that nothing else could have. The silence that remained after his confession was no longer heavy, but shared. A space where healing could begin. A space where their unlikely love could, perhaps, truly flourish. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful cry, but inside, a fragile warmth had started to spread. Chapter 8. Scars Beneath the Surface. The days following Enzo's confession were marked by a profound shift in their relationship. The walls he had carefully constructed around himself began to crumble, revealing the vulnerable, wounded man beneath. He was still the capo, still the powerful, dangerous leader of the Vitali family, but he was also human. He allowed himself to be seen, to be known, in a way that he never had before. He started to share more of himself with Katerina, telling her stories of his childhood, his mother's gentle nature, his father's strict, often brutal, lessons. He spoke of his loneliness, his isolation, the burden of responsibility that had been thrust upon him at such a young age. Katerina listened patiently, offering him comfort and understanding, without judgment. She realized that his ruthlessness, his cold demeanor, were simply masks, defense mechanisms honed over years of living in a world where weakness was a liability, where survival depended on strength and control. She began to see the scars beneath the surface, the emotional wounds that had never fully healed. The loss of his parents, the guilt he carried, the constant threat of violence that hung over him like a dark cloud. She understood that his silence, his guarded nature, were not signs of indifference, but of a deep-seated fear of vulnerability, of being hurt again. One evening, as they were walking in the garden, he stopped and turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "Katerina," he said, his voice husky, I have never spoken of these things to anyone. Not to my family. Not to my closest advisors. Not to anyone." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I know," she said softly. "And I am honored that you trust me." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, as if drawing strength from her presence. "I don't deserve your kindness," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I have done terrible things. Things that cannot be forgiven." She shook her head. "Everyone makes mistakes, Enzo. Everyone has regrets. What matters is what you do now, how you choose to live your life." He opened his eyes, his gaze searching hers. I want to be different," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to change. For you. For us." Katerina's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and fear. She knew that change wouldn't be easy, that the shadows of his past would always linger. But she also saw a genuine desire in his eyes, a willingness to try, to become a better man. "I will help you," she said, her voice firm. "I will be by your side. Every step of the way." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. He took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. They continued their walk, their hands clasped together, their silence no longer a barrier, but a shared understanding, a connection that transcended words. As they walked, Katerina noticed a small, almost hidden scar on Enzo's wrist, partially concealed by his watch. She had never seen it before. It was thin, white, and looked old, but it stood out against his tan skin. "Enzo," she asked gently, pointing to the scar, "what is this?" He looked down at his wrist, his expression shifting, a shadow crossing his face. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to reveal the story behind the scar. "It was a long time ago," he said finally, his voice low and hesitant. "When I was a boy. Before my parents died." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant sea. "I was playing. Near the docks. I fell. I cut myself. On a broken bottle." Katerina sensed that he was holding something back, that the story was incomplete. She waited patiently, her hand still resting on his arm. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. It wasn't just an accident, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I was angry. I was fighting. With another boy.
He pushed me.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. He was Salerno's son.
Marco.
We were rivals. Even then, Katerina understood. The feud between the Vitales and the Salernos had spanned generations, poisoning their lives, shaping their destinies. Even as children, they had been caught up in the conflict, their innocence tainted by the hatred and violence that surrounded them. It's in the past, Enzo, she said softly. It doesn't define you. He shook his head. It reminds me, he said, his voice tight, of who I was, of what I could become, if I let myself. Katerina saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of succumbing to the darkness, of becoming the ruthless, unfeeling man his father had been. She tightened her grip on his hand, offering him reassurance, support. You are not your father, Enzo, she told him, firmly. You are a good man. You are capable of kindness and love and forgiveness. He met her gaze questioningly, and she added, I see it. Every day. I see who you're becoming. The scar was a reminder, yes, but it was also a symbol. A symbol of the past, of the wounds that had shaped him, but also of his resilience, his ability to survive, to overcome. And in that moment, Katerina knew that their journey together would be about healing those wounds, about confronting the shadows, about forging a new path, a new legacy, built not on violence and fear, but on love and trust. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the garden, but the warmth of their intertwined hands remained. A silent promise in the growing twilight. Chapter 9. A flicker of defiance. The relative peace of the Vitali estate was disrupted by an unexpected summons. A formal invitation arrived, embossed with the Salerno family crest, a coiled viper, ready to strike. It was an invitation to a lavish party, hosted by Don Carlo Salerno himself, to celebrate his 70th birthday. Enzo's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face hardened, his eyes darkened, his body tensing with barely suppressed rage. I will not go, he said, his voice tight with anger. I will not set foot in that man's house. Katerina understood his reluctance, his hatred for the man who had orchestrated the murder of his parents. But she also knew that refusing the invitation would be seen as a sign of disrespect, a challenge, a provocation that could reignite the feud between the families. Enzo, she said gently, I understand how you feel, but perhaps it is necessary to maintain the peace, to show strength. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and frustration.
Peace? He scoffed.
There is no peace with the Salernos. Only a temporary truce. A waiting game. He paced restlessly across the room, his hands clenched into fists. He wants me there, he continued, his voice low and dangerous. He wants to humiliate me, to remind me of what he took from me. Katerina approached him, placing a calming hand on his arm. He wants to see if you are afraid, Enzo. He wants to see weakness. You cannot give him that satisfaction. And you are not the boy who fell on the docks. Show him the man you have become. He stopped pacing, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering the implications of attending the party. And you? He asked, his voice softening slightly. Would you go with me? Into the lion's den? Katerina didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, her voice firm. I will be by your side. Always. His eyes searched hers. There was fear there, yes, but also a request, a dependence that was entirely new. The decision was made. They would attend the Salerno party. It was a dangerous gamble, a walk into the heart of enemy territory, but it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to show strength, to demonstrate unity, to defy the expectations of their enemies. The preparations for the party were elaborate and meticulous. Katerina chose a gown of deep emerald green, a color that symbolized hope and resilience. It was elegant, understated, but it also conveyed a sense of quiet confidence. Enzo, as always, wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his demeanor imposing and controlled. As they drove to the Salerno estate, the tension in the car was palpable. Enzo was silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his jaw tight. Caterina reached out and took his hand, her touch offering reassurance, support. The Salerno estate was even more opulent than the Vitali mansion, a sprawling, ostentatious display of wealth and power. The party was in full swing when they arrived, the grand ballroom filled with guests, the air thick with a scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and tension. Don Carlo Salerno, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes, greeted them at the entrance. He embraced Enzo, a gesture of false camaraderie, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Enzo," he said, his voice booming, "I am so glad you could make it. And this must be your lovely wife, Caterina. Welcome. Welcome to my home." Caterina met his gaze with a polite smile, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the hatred emanating from him, the barely concealed animosity that simmered beneath the surface of his cordial greeting. They were ushered into the ballroom, where they were immediately surrounded by guests, a mix of family members, business associates, and rivals. Caterina sensed the watchful eyes, the whispered conversations, the undercurrent of tension that permeated the room. Enzo remained close to her side, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. He navigated the crowd with a practiced ease, exchanging greetings with acquaintances, his demeanor cool and detached. Caterina noticed Marco Salerno, Enzo's childhood rival, across the room. He was staring at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and malice. He approached them, a smirk playing on his lips. "Enzo," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "long time no see. And you brought your bride. How domestic." Enzo's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Marco," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I suggest you watch your tongue." Marco laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Or what, Enzo? Will you cut me again? Like you did when we were children?" He gestured towards Enzo's wrist, a subtle reminder of their past encounter, of the scar that still marked him. Caterina saw the flicker of anger in Enzo's eyes, the urge to retaliate, to silence Marco's taunts. She stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. "Marco," she said, her voice calm and controlled, "this is neither the time nor the place. Let us enjoy the party and respect our host." Her words, her unexpected intervention, seemed to diffuse the tension. Marco looked at her, surprised by her boldness, her defiance. He hesitated for a moment, then backed down. "As you wish, Signora Vitali," he said, his voice still laced with sarcasm, but his retreat was clear. He turned and walked away, leaving Enzo and Caterina alone. Caterina took a deep, steadying breath. Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low. "We are a team, Enzo," she said, her voice firm. "We face this together." It was a small victory, a flicker of defiance in the face of their enemies, but it was significant. Caterina had shown strength, courage, and a loyalty that transcended her arranged marriage. She had proven that she was not just a pawn, not just a prize, but a partner, a force to be reckoned with. And as they stood there, together, in the heart of enemy territory, a new sense of unity, of purpose, began to emerge. A defiance that was not just about survival, but about building something new, something stronger, on the ashes of the past. The night was far from over, however, and the viper's nest was full of hidden dangers. Chapter 10. The Lion and the Lamb. The evening progressed, a tense dance of veiled threats and forced pleasantries. Caterina and Enzo navigated the crowded ballroom, their every move scrutinized, their every word dissected. They were surrounded by enemies, by rivals, by those who wished to see them fail. But they held their ground, presenting a united front, a picture of strength and resilience. Caterina found herself drawn into conversations with various women, wives and daughters of powerful men, their lives as carefully orchestrated, as controlled, as her own. She listened to their stories, their veiled complaints, their subtle expressions of discontent. She saw the loneliness, the fear, the quiet desperation that lay beneath the surface of their glamorous facades. She realized that she was not alone in her struggles, that many of these women were trapped in gilded cages, just as she was.
But she also saw a difference.
She had found something in her marriage to Enzo, something unexpected, something real. She had found a connection, a partnership, a love that was beginning to blossom in the darkness. She found herself separated from Enzo at one point, drawn into a conversation with Don Carlo Salerno's wife, a woman named Sofia. Sofia was older than Caterina, her face etched with lines of worry and regret. She seemed kind, gentle, a stark contrast to her ruthless husband. Caterina, Sofia said, her voice low and hesitant, be careful. This world, it is not what it seems. There are dangers. Everywhere. Caterina sensed a warning in her words, a genuine concern for her well-being. I know, she said softly, but I am not afraid. Sofia looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. You are stronger than you think, she said. And Enzo, he is different. With you. Caterina felt a warmth spread through her chest. Sofia's words confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Enzo was changing, evolving, shedding the layers of darkness that had encased him for so long. And she, Caterina, was the catalyst for that change. Later in the evening, Enzo found her on the terrace, overlooking the moonlit gardens. He stood beside her, his presence a comforting weight in the cool night air. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low and concerned. She nodded, turning to face him. Yes, she said. But this is exhausting. This constant pretense. This game of shadows. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly.
I know, he said.
But it is necessary.
For now.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. I wish things were different, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wish we could escape. From all of this. Caterina reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Perhaps one day, she said softly. Perhaps we can. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, as if savoring the moment of connection, of intimacy. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking on hers. Caterina, he said, his voice husky. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. He seemed to be on the verge of a confession, a declaration, but he held back, his fear, his ingrained caution, holding him captive. Suddenly, a commotion erupted inside the ballroom. Shouts, screams, the shattering of glass. Enzo's body tensed, his eyes narrowing. He grabbed Caterina's hand, pulling her back inside. Stay close to me, he ordered, his voice low and urgent. They entered the ballroom to find chaos. Guests were scrambling, panicked, trying to escape. In the center of the room, a fight had broken out. Two men were grappling, their faces contorted with rage. One of them was Marco Salerno. The other was one of Enzo's men, a loyal lieutenant named Giovanni. Don Carlo Salerno was shouting, trying to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the din. Enzo pushed his way through the crowd, Caterina clinging to his side. He reached the center of the room, his eyes blazing with fury. Enough! He roared, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The fighting stopped instantly. Marco and Giovanni separated, their chests heaving, their faces bruised and bloody. What is the meaning of this? Enzo demanded, his gaze sweeping the room. Marco glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred. Your man, he insulted me, he spat. He disrespected my family. Giovanni stepped forward, his voice defiant. He was talking about the Signora Vitali, he said, his gaze shifting to Caterina. He was saying things. Unforgivable things. Caterina felt a chill run down her spine. Marco's words, his earlier taunts, had not been forgotten. He had deliberately provoked Giovanni, knowing that he would defend Caterina's honor, knowing that it would lead to violence. Enzo looked at Marco, his eyes filled with a cold, deadly rage. "You dare," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You dare to insult my wife. In my presence." He took a step towards Marco, his body tensing, ready to strike. Katerina knew that he was on the verge of unleashing his fury, of resorting to the violence that was so deeply ingrained in his nature. She stepped forward, placing herself between the two men, mirroring her earlier action. "Enzo," she said, her voice calm but firm.
"No."
"This is what he wants. He wants to provoke you. He wants to start a war." Enzo looked at her, his eyes struggling with the conflict within him. The lion, ready to pounce, to destroy his enemy, and the lamb, urging him to restraint, to peace. He hesitated for a moment, his body trembling with the effort to control his rage. Then slowly he relaxed. He took a deep breath, regaining his composure. "You are right," he said, his voice still tight with anger but controlled. He turned to Don Carlos Salerno. "This ends now," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "Your son will apologize. To my wife. And to my man. Or there will be consequences." Don Carlos Salerno looked at Enzo, his eyes filled with a grudging respect. He knew that he had underestimated Enzo, that he had pushed him too far. He knew that he had to back down, or risk igniting a war that could destroy them all. He nodded, his face grim. "Marco," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "apologize." Marco glared at his father, his face contorted with defiance. But he knew that he had no choice. He reluctantly mumbled an apology, his words insincere, his eyes still filled with hatred. Enzo accepted the apology with a curt nod. He turned to Katerina, his gaze softening. "Let's go," he said, his voice gentle. They left the party, their departure swift and silent. The lion and the lamb, walking side by side, leaving behind the chaos, the violence, the simmering tensions of the serpent's den. They had faced the enemy, and they had prevailed. Not through violence, but through strength, through unity, through a love that was beginning to defy the odds. But the night's events had stirred the nest, and the vipers were undoubtedly plotting. Chapter 11. Blood on the cobblestones. The drive back to the Vitali estate was silent, the tension from the evening lingering in the air. Katerina replayed the events in her mind, the fight, Marco's taunts, Enzo's near loss of control. She had seen the darkness in him, the potential for violence, but she had also seen his restraint, his willingness to listen to her, to choose a different path. As they approached the estate, Enzo suddenly slammed on the brakes, his body tensing. Katerina looked up, startled, and saw the reason for his abrupt stop. The wrought iron gates, usually standing tall and imposing, were twisted and mangled, lying on the ground. "Stay here," Enzo ordered, his voice low and urgent. He reached under his seat, pulling out a gun, his movements swift and practiced. Katerina's heart pounded in her chest. She knew, instinctively, that this was not a random act of vandalism. This was a message, a threat, a declaration of war. Enzo cautiously exited the car, his gun held ready, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. Katerina disobeyed his order, her fear for his safety overriding her own. She got out of the car, staying close behind him. The driveway was deserted, the silence eerie and unsettling. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the night breeze and the distant crash of waves against the shore. They approached the house slowly, their senses on high alert. As they rounded a corner, they saw it. A scene of carnage. Several of Enzo's men lay on the ground, their bodies riddled with bullets, their blood staining the cobblestones. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Enzo let out a roar of rage and grief, his composure shattering. He knelt beside one of the fallen men, a young man named Antonio, who had been particularly loyal to him. "Antonio," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. No, Katerina stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror before her. She had never seen such violence, such brutality, up close. It was a stark reminder of the world she had married into, the constant threat of death that hung over them like a dark cloud. Enzo rose, his face a mask of fury, his eyes blazing with a cold, deadly rage. "Salerno," he growled, his voice filled with venom. "He will pay. For this." He turned to Katerina, his expression softening slightly, but his eyes still burning with the fire of vengeance. "Go inside," he said, his voice hoarse. "Lock yourself in the safe room. Do not come out until I tell you." Katerina knew that he was trying to protect her, that he was afraid for her safety. But she couldn't leave him, not now, not when he was consumed by such grief and rage.
"No," she said, her voice firm.
"I will not hide. I will stay with you." He looked at her, surprised by her defiance, her refusal to obey his order. He seemed to be searching her eyes, assessing her resolve. "Katerina," he said, his voice pleading, "this is dangerous. I cannot protect you. If something happens to me, I am not afraid." "Enzo," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "I am your wife. I will face this with you. We are in this together." He hesitated for a moment, his internal struggle evident on his face. Then slowly he nodded. He reached out and took her hand, his grip tight and reassuring. "Very well," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Together. We will avenge them. We will make Salerno pay." He led her towards the house, his gun still in his hand, his senses on high alert. They entered the house, the silence inside even more unsettling than the darkness outside. As they made their way through the darkened hallways, they heard a sound. A faint moan, coming from one of the rooms. Enzo cautiously approached the door, his gun raised. He kicked the door open, ready to fire. Inside the room, they found another one of Enzo's men, wounded but alive. He was lying on the floor, clutching his side, his face pale and drawn. "Salvatore," Enzo said, his voice filled with relief. "What happened? Who did this?" Salvatore coughed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Salerno's men," he whispered. "They came like shadows. They were everywhere." He paused, his eyes widening with fear. They took someone," he said, his voice barely audible. "They took Isabella." Katerina felt a jolt of surprise, followed by a wave of confusion. "Isabella? Why would the Salernos take Isabella?" She was Salvatore Rossi's niece, a member of their own extended family, a woman who had made no secret of her animosity towards Katerina. Enzo's reaction was equally perplexed. "Isabella?" he said, his voice questioning.
"Why?"
Salvatore shook his head weakly. I don't know," he whispered. "They said something about a message." "A message for you." Enzo's eyes narrowed, his mind racing, trying to decipher the meaning of Salerno's actions. He knew that it was a trap, a ploy to lure him into a confrontation. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore it. Isabella, whatever her faults, was still connected to them, and he had a responsibility to protect her, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. But a seed of doubt had been planted, a small nagging voice questioning Isabella's innocence. Could she possibly be involved? The question twisted with the horror of the night. "We have to go after her," he said, his voice grim. "We have to find her. Before it's too late." The night had turned from a celebration of defiance into a nightmare of blood and betrayal. The cobblestones were stained, and the future was uncertain, shrouded in a darkness more profound than any Katerina had yet encountered. The line between friend and foe had blurred, and Enzo was ready for war. Chapter 12. Masks of Deception. The decision to rescue Isabella was fraught with tension and uncertainty. Enzo knew it was a trap, a calculated move by Don Carlo Salerno to lure him into a vulnerable position. But he couldn't abandon Isabella, not without knowing her fate. The code of the Famiglia, however twisted, demanded a response. He gathered his remaining men, those who had survived the attack on the estate. They were a small, battle-hardened group, their faces grim, their loyalty unwavering. They prepared for a confrontation, arming themselves with weapons, their movements swift and practiced. Katerina watched them, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she couldn't stay behind, that she couldn't hide in the safe room while Enzo risked his life. She had to be with him, to support him, to face whatever dangers lay ahead. She approached him, her expression resolute. "Enzo," she said, her voice firm, "I am going with you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Katerina, no," he said, his voice pleading. "This is too dangerous. I cannot allow it. I am not asking for your permission." "Enzo," she said, her voice unwavering. "I am your wife. I will stand by your side, no matter what." He searched her eyes, seeing the strength, the courage, the unwavering loyalty that shone within them. He knew that he couldn't dissuade her, that her determination was as strong as his own. "Very well," he said, his voice resigned. "But you will stay close to me. You will do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" She nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and love. She was terrified, yes, but she was also proud to be standing beside him, to be facing this challenge together. They set off in a convoy of cars, speeding through the night, their destination a known Salerno stronghold, a warehouse on the outskirts of Naples. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the roar of the engines and the crackle of the radio. As they approached the warehouse, Enzo gave his orders, his voice low and urgent. They would approach cautiously, using stealth and surprise to their advantage. He divided his men into teams, each with a specific task, a coordinated plan of attack. Katerina stayed close to Enzo, her senses on high alert. She had never been in a situation like this before, surrounded by violence, by the threat of death. But she held her ground, her fear tempered by a newfound courage, a determination to protect the man she loved. They entered the warehouse silently, their movements like shadows in the darkness. The warehouse was vast and cavernous, filled with crates and machinery, the air thick with the smell of oil and dust. They moved through the warehouse cautiously, their guns raised, their eyes scanning the surroundings. They encountered resistance, pockets of Salerno's men, engaging in brief, intense firefights. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the warehouse, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Katerina stayed close to Enzo, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with fear. But she didn't falter. She didn't hesitate. She followed his lead, trusting in his experience, his skill, his determination to protect her. They finally reached the center of the warehouse, where they found Isabella. She was tied to a chair, her face bruised and bloodied, her eyes filled with terror. Don Carlo Salerno stood beside her, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Enzo," he said, his voice mocking, "you came, just as I expected." Enzo glared at him, his eyes blazing with fury. "Let her go, Salerno," he growled, his voice dangerously low. "This is between you and me." Salerno laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Oh, but it's not, Enzo. It's about family. It's about loyalty. It's about betrayal." He gestured towards Isabella. "Your wife's family," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They betrayed you, Enzo. They sold you out. They made a deal with me." Katerina felt a jolt of shock, followed by a wave of disbelief. Isabella? A traitor? It couldn't be true. But she saw the look on Enzo's face, the flicker of doubt, of uncertainty, that crossed his eyes. "You lie," Enzo said, his voice tight with anger, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Salerno smiled, a triumphant gleam in his eyes.
Doi.
"Ask her. Ask Isabella. Ask her about the plan. The plan to eliminate you. To take control of the Vitali family." All eyes turned to Isabella. She looked at Enzo, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, a shot rang out. Isabella slumped in her chair, her body lifeless, a bullet hole in her forehead. Katerina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared in horror at Isabella's body, the suddenness of her death shocking and brutal. The shot had come from behind them. Enzo whirled around, his gun raised, ready to fire. He saw one of his own men, a man named Luca, standing there, a smoking gun in his hand. "Luca," Enzo said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What have you done?" Luca looked at Enzo, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "She was a traitor," he said, his voice flat. She deserved to die. He raised his gun, pointing it at Enzo. And so do you, he said. Katerina screamed, her voice piercing the silence. Enzo reacted instantly, diving for cover as Luca fired. The bullet missed him by inches, embedding itself in a nearby crate. Enzo returned fire, his shots accurate and deadly. Luca fell to the ground, his body riddled with bullets, his life extinguished in an instant. The warehouse fell silent, the only sounds the ragged breathing of the survivors. Enzo stood there, his body trembling with rage and betrayal. He had been betrayed, not only by Isabella, but by one of his own men, a man he had trusted. The deception was multi-layered, a conspiracy that had reached deep into the heart of his own family. And it was all orchestrated, with cold precision, by Katerina's first husband's family. Or so it seemed. The masks had fallen, revealing the ugly truth beneath. But the truth was a tangled web, and untangling it would be a deadly game. And Katerina was left to wonder, in the smoky silence of the warehouse, who she could truly trust. Chapter 13. The Heart's Reckoning. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation was a whirlwind of chaos and grief. Enzo, reeling from the double betrayal of Isabella and Luca, ordered a swift and brutal investigation. He was determined to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy, to find out who else was involved, to root out the treachery that had infiltrated his ranks. Katerina, shaken by the violence she had witnessed, struggled to reconcile the conflicting emotions that surged within her. She had seen Enzo at his most ruthless, his most vulnerable, his most human. She had also seen the depths of betrayal, the chilling reality of the world they inhabited. She found herself questioning everyone. Isabella's alleged treachery, Luca's betrayal, Salerno's accusations. It was all a tangled web of deceit, and she didn't know who to trust. Even Enzo, the man she had come to love, was shrouded in a veil of suspicion. Could he have been involved in some way in the plot against him? The thought was unbearable, but she couldn't dismiss it entirely. She needed answers. She needed clarity. She needed to understand the truth. She decided to conduct her own investigation, quietly, discreetly, without Enzo's knowledge. She knew that it was a dangerous game, that she was risking her own safety, but she couldn't stand idly by while her life, her future, hung in the balance. She started by examining Isabella's belongings, which had been brought back to the Vitali estate after her death. She searched through her clothes, her jewelry, her personal papers, looking for any clue, any hint of her involvement in the conspiracy. She found nothing concrete, nothing that definitively proved Isabella's guilt. But she did find something curious. A small, antique locket, hidden inside a secret compartment in Isabella's jewelry box. The locket contained a miniature portrait of a man Katerina didn't recognize. She studied the portrait closely, trying to decipher its significance. The man was handsome, with dark hair and piercing eyes. He looked familiar, somehow, but she couldn't place him. She decided to seek help, to consult someone who might be able to identify the man in the portrait. She turned to Sofia Salerno, Don Carlos Salerno's wife, the woman who had warned her about the dangers of their world. She arranged a secret meeting with Sofia, away from the prying eyes of both the Vitali and Salerno families. They met in a small, secluded cafe in a quiet neighborhood far from the centers of power. Katerina showed Sofia the locket, the miniature portrait. Sofia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was Isabella's," Katerina said. "I found it among her belongings." Sofia looked at the portrait again, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and recognition. This is Giovanni," she said, her voice barely audible. "Giovanni Rossi." Katerina felt a jolt of surprise. Rossi? Isabella's family name? But she had never heard of a Giovanni Rossi. Who is he?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Sofia hesitated for a moment, as if struggling to decide whether to reveal the truth. He was Isabella's brother," she said finally, her voice low and filled with pain.
Salvatore si legittimazzo.
He was disowned, cast out, by the family. Katerina's mind reeled. Isabella had a brother? A secret brother? And he was connected to the Rossi family? It was all too much to comprehend.
Why?
She asked, her voice trembling. Why was he disowned? Sophia looked at her, her eyes filled with a deep sadness.
Because he was different, she said.
He didn't want any part of this life. He rejected the family, the business.
He wanted out.
She paused, her gaze drifting towards the window. Salvatore, he couldn't accept that. He saw it as a betrayal. He had him banished. He forbade anyone from speaking his name. Caterina understood now. Giovanni Rossi, the disowned brother, the outcast. He had a motive, a reason to seek revenge against both the Vitalis and the Salernos, the families that had wronged him. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that Giovanni Rossi was the mastermind behind the conspiracy, the puppet master pulling the strings, manipulating everyone, including Isabella and Luca, to achieve his own ends. She had to tell Enzo. She had to warn him. But she also knew that she needed proof, concrete evidence to support her theory. She couldn't risk accusing Giovanni Rossi without something to back it up. She thanked Sophia for her help, promising to keep their meeting a secret. She left the cafe, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She returned to the Vitali estate, her resolve strengthened. She had a new lead, a new suspect, a new path to follow. She would uncover the truth. She would expose Giovanni Rossi. She would clear Enzo's name, and she would save their love. But as she entered the estate, she was met with a scene of chaos. Enzo's men were rushing around, their faces grim, their voices urgent. She approached one of them, a man named Marco Salerno, who had always been loyal to Enzo. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and grief. It's Enzo, he said, his voice hoarse. He's been attacked. He's in the hospital. He's fighting for his life. Caterina felt the world spin around her. Enzo attacked? Fighting for his life. It couldn't be true. It was a nightmare, a cruel twist of fate. She rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear and despair. She had to see him. She had to be with him. She had to tell him what she had discovered. But as she arrived at the hospital, she was met with a wall of silence. Enzo's men, their faces grim and unyielding, refused to let her see him. They told her that he was in critical condition, that he was undergoing surgery, that she couldn't see him. Caterina pleaded. She begged. She demanded to see him. But they wouldn't budge. They were protecting him, they said, following his orders. She was left alone, in the sterile, cold waiting room, her heart breaking, her mind consumed by fear and doubt. Was this another betrayal? Another twist in the conspiracy? Was Enzo truly injured? Or was this a ruse, a way to silence her, to prevent her from exposing the truth? The weight of her suspicions, the burden of her secrets, pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. She was alone, isolated, surrounded by enemies, and she didn't know who to trust. The heart's reckoning had come, and it was a brutal, devastating blow. She was left with nothing but questions, and the answers seemed to be slipping further and further away. The silence of the waiting room was deafening, punctuated only by her own ragged breaths. Chapter 14. Echoes of Betrayal. The hours in the hospital waiting room stretched into an eternity. Caterina paced restlessly, her mind a whirlwind of fear, doubt, and suspicion. She replayed the events of the past few weeks, searching for clues, for connections, for anything that might shed light on Enzo's attack and the ongoing conspiracy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being manipulated, that she was a pawn in a deadly game, and she didn't know who was pulling the strings. Was Enzo truly injured, or was this a ruse to silence her, to prevent her from exposing Giovanni Rossi? Was his inner circle truly loyal, or were they part of the plot? She tried to reach Enzo's men, to get information about his condition, but they remained tight-lipped, offering only vague assurances and evasive answers. They were protecting him, they said, following his orders. But Katerina sensed a deeper deception, a hidden agenda that she couldn't quite decipher. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She slipped away from the waiting room, unnoticed, and began to explore the hospital, searching for Enzo's room, for any sign of his true condition. She navigated the sterile corridors, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She avoided the nurses and doctors, sticking to the shadows, her movements stealthy and cautious. She finally found his room, guarded by two of Enzo's men, their faces grim and unyielding. She tried to approach them, to plead with them to let her see him, but they refused, their orders absolute. She retreated, frustrated and desperate, but she didn't give up. She found a secluded alcove, hidden from view, and waited, watching the door to Enzo's room, hoping for an opportunity to slip inside. Hours passed, and the hospital grew quiet, the activity slowing as the night wore on. Katerina remained hidden, her body aching, her mind exhausted, but her determination unwavering.
Finally, she saw her chance.
The two guards, weary from their long vigil, stepped away from the door for a moment, their attention diverted by a passing nurse. Katerina seized the opportunity, slipping past them, unnoticed, and entering Enzo's room. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small bedside lamp. Enzo lay in the bed, his body still and lifeless, his face pale and drawn. He was hooked up to various machines, monitoring his vital signs, the rhythmic beeping a constant reminder of his precarious condition. Katerina approached the bed, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and relief. He was alive, but he was broken. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm. His skin was cold, clammy. "Enzo," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me, Katerina. I'm here." He didn't respond. He remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. She continued to speak to him, telling him about her discovery, about Giovanni Rossi, about the conspiracy that threatened to destroy them both. She poured out her heart, her fears, her doubts, her love. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her. She turned, startled, and saw one of Enzo's men, Marco the Loyal One, standing in the doorway, his face filled with a mixture of shock and anger. "Signora Vitali," he said, his voice harsh. "What are you doing here? You were told to stay away." Katerina stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. I needed to see him," she said, her voice firm. "I have information. Important information. About the attack. About the conspiracy." Marco looked at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What information?" he asked, his voice guarded. Katerina hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust him. But she had no choice. She had to tell someone. She had to expose Giovanni Rossi before it was too late. "It's Giovanni Rossi," she said, her voice low and urgent. "He's behind it all. He's the one who orchestrated the attack. He's the one who betrayed Enzo." Marco stared at her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her credibility. "Giovanni Rossi?" he said, his voice questioning. "But he's dead. He disappeared. Years ago." Katerina shook her head.
"He's not dead," she said.
"He's alive. And he's been plotting. Against both families. The Vitales and the Salernos." She explained her discovery, the locket, the miniature portrait, her conversation with Sofia Salerno. She laid out her theory, her evidence, her conviction that Giovanni Rossi was the mastermind behind the conspiracy. Marco listened intently, his expression shifting from suspicion to belief. He realized that Katerina's story made sense, that it explained the seemingly random attacks, the betrayals, the chaos that had engulfed them. We have to warn the others," he said, his voice urgent. "We have to stop him. Before he strikes again." He turned to leave the room, to gather the remaining loyal men, to prepare for a confrontation with Giovanni Rossi. But before he could take a step, a voice stopped him. "It's too late," the voice said, weak but clear. Katerina and Marco turned to see Enzo, his eyes open, his gaze fixed on them. He was awake, he was conscious, he had heard everything. He struggled to speak and managed, with effort. He'd a nose. The betrayal had echoed, and now it had reached its intended target. The question was, could they survive its final reverberation? The room held its breath. Chapter 15. The Price of Loyalty. Enzo's weak but clear voice sent a jolt of both relief and dread through Caterina. Relief that he was alive, that he had regained consciousness. Dread at the implications of his words. He knows Giovanni Rossi knew that Caterina had uncovered his plot, that she was a threat. Enzo, Caterina rushed to his side, her voice filled with a mixture of joy and concern. You're awake, you heard me? He nodded weakly, his eyes struggling to focus. Giovanni Rossi, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He's dangerous.
He won't stop.
Marco stepped forward, his expression grim. We have to protect you, Don Enzo, he said. We have to get you out of here. This hospital is not safe. Enzo nodded again, his agreement clear. He knew that he was a target, that Giovanni Rossi would not hesitate to finish what he had started. They quickly devised a plan, a desperate gamble to escape the hospital and find a safe haven. Marco gathered the remaining loyal men, those he trusted implicitly, and prepared for a covert extraction. Caterina stayed by Enzo's side, her presence a constant reassurance, her touch a lifeline. She helped him dress, his movements slow and painful, his body weakened by the attack. They slipped out of the hospital room, unnoticed, and made their way through the darkened corridors, their movements stealthy and cautious. They avoided the nurses and doctors, sticking to the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached a back exit where a car was waiting, its engine running. They bundled Enzo into the car, Caterina beside him, Marco at the wheel. They sped away from the hospital, leaving behind the chaos, the uncertainty, the constant threat of betrayal. Their destination was a secluded villa, high in the hills overlooking Naples, a safe house known only to a select few. It was a place where Enzo could recover, where they could regroup, where they could plan their next move. As they drove, Caterina tended to Enzo's wounds, her touch gentle and soothing. She monitored his vital signs, her concern etched on her face. Enzo, she said softly, you need to rest. You need to heal. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. Caterina, he whispered, his voice hoarse, you saved me. You uncovered the truth. She smiled, a fragile smile that belied the fear that still gnawed at her. We saved each other, she said. We are a team. Remember? He nodded, his eyes closing, his body succumbing to exhaustion. He drifted off to sleep, his hand clasped tightly in hers. They reached the villa, a sprawling, secluded estate surrounded by high walls and dense vegetation. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, a place where they could feel, at least for a moment, safe. They settled Enzo into a comfortable room, overlooking the breathtaking view of the Bay of Naples. Caterina stayed by his side, watching over him, her presence a constant vigil. As Enzo slept, Caterina and Marco discussed their next move. They knew that Giovanni Rossi was still out there, that he was planning his next attack, that he wouldn't rest until he had eliminated Enzo and taken control of the Vitali family. We have to find him, Marco said, his voice grim. We have to stop him. Before he strikes again. Caterina nodded, her determination unwavering. But how? She asked. He's like a ghost. He disappears. He leaves no trace. Marco hesitated for a moment, his expression troubled. There is one person, he said finally, his voice low and hesitant, who might know. Where he is. Where he's hiding. Who? Caterina asked, her voice urgent. Marco looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of reluctance and fear. Sofia Salerno, he said. Don Carlo's wife.
She knows Giovanni.
She helped him. In the past. Caterina remembered her meeting with Sofia, the warning she had given her, the information she had revealed about Giovanni Rossi. She realized that Sofia was more than just an innocent bystander, that she was deeply involved in the conspiracy, that she held the key to finding Giovanni. But reaching Sofia would be dangerous, almost impossible. She was under constant surveillance by Don Carlo's men, her every move watched, her every communication monitored. They devised a plan, a risky gamble to contact Sofia, to extract information from her, to uncover Giovanni Rossi's hiding place. It was a desperate plan, fraught with peril, but it was their only hope. Caterina volunteered to go, to meet with Sofia, to risk her own safety to save Enzo and bring Giovanni Rossi to justice. She knew that it was a dangerous mission, that she could be walking into a trap, but she didn't hesitate. "I will go," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I will find her. I will get the information. I will bring him down." Her loyalty to Enzo, her love for him, had transformed her. She was no longer the timid, submissive woman she had once been. She was a warrior, a fighter, a woman willing to risk everything for the man she loved, for the family she had chosen. The price of loyalty was high, but Caterina was willing to pay it. She would face the danger, she would confront the betrayal, she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The night was dark, but her resolve burned bright, a beacon of hope in the encroaching shadows. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 16. A Love Forged in Fire. The plan to contact Sofia Salerno was audacious and fraught with peril. Caterina, disguised as a cleaning woman, would infiltrate the Salerno estate, using her knowledge of the household routines gained during the ill-fated birthday party to her advantage. She would seek out Sofia, hoping to appeal to her conscience, to convince her to betray Giovanni Rossi and reveal his hiding place. Marco provided her with a detailed layout of the estate, highlighting the security measures, the patrol routes, the blind spots. He also gave her a small, concealed communication device, allowing her to stay in contact with him and the other loyal Vitali men who would be waiting nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Caterina prepared for the mission, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she was walking into a trap, that she could be captured, tortured, or even killed. But she didn't hesitate. She had to do this for Enzo, for their future, for the chance to finally break free from the cycle of violence and betrayal that had plagued their lives. She donned the simple, unassuming uniform of a cleaning woman, her elegant clothes and jewelry hidden beneath the drab fabric. She tied her hair back, concealing her features beneath a plain scarf. She looked in the mirror, her reflection a stranger, a woman transformed by circumstance, by love, by a fierce determination to protect what was hers. She left the secluded villa under the cover of darkness, her movements stealthy and cautious. Marco drove her to the outskirts of the Salerno estate, dropping her off a safe distance from the main entrance. "Be careful, Caterina," he said, his voice filled with concern. "This is dangerous. If anything goes wrong, get out. We will find another way." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I will," she said. "But I won't fail. I promise you." She slipped into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She approached the Salerno estate, her senses on high alert, her every move calculated, her every breath measured. She found a blind spot in the security perimeter, a small gap in the wall, hidden by dense vegetation. She slipped through the gap, unnoticed, and entered the grounds of the Salerno estate. She moved through the gardens, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the patrol routes, her movements silent and graceful. She reached the main house, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She entered the house through a back entrance, a service entrance used by the staff. She knew the layout of the house, the location of Sofia's private quarters, the routines of the household. She made her way through the darkened hallways, her footsteps silent on the marble floors. She avoided the servants, the guards, the watchful eyes of the Salerno family. She finally reached Sofia's private suite, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, gathering her courage, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She knocked softly on the door, her voice low and urgent. "Signora Salerno," she whispered. "It's me, Caterina. I need to talk to you. It's important." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. The door opened slowly, revealing Sofia Salerno, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and surprise. "Katerina," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? It's dangerous." Katerina stepped inside the room, closing the door behind her. I know," she said, her voice low and urgent. "But I need your help. Giovanni Rossi. He's behind everything. He attacked Enzo. He tried to kill him." Sofia stared at her, her expression unreadable. She seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her credibility. I know," Sofia said finally, her voice barely audible.
"I suspected."
But I couldn't believe it. Katerina approached her, her gaze pleading. "He's planning something, Sofia," she said. "Something terrible. You have to tell me. Where is he? Where is he hiding?" Sofia hesitated for a moment, her internal struggle evident on her face. She was torn between her loyalty to her family, her fear of Giovanni Rossi, and her conscience. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. He'll kill me. He'll kill everyone I love." Katerina reached out and took her hand, her touch gentle but firm. "He won't," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "We will protect you. We will stop him. But we need your help. Please, Sofia. Tell me where he is." Sofia looked at her, her eyes filled with tears. She saw the strength, the courage, the unwavering determination in Katerina's gaze. She saw the love that had driven her to risk everything, to confront the darkness, to fight for her future. She made a decision, a choice that would change everything. She betrayed her family. She betrayed Giovanni Rossi. She betrayed the code of silence that had governed her life. "He's at the old factory," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The one by the docks. The one where it all began." Katerina felt a jolt of recognition. The old factory, the scene of Enzo's childhood trauma, the place where he had been scarred, both physically and emotionally. It was a fitting location for the final confrontation, the culmination of a lifetime of violence and betrayal. It was where his parents were killed. She thanked Sofia, promising to protect her, to keep her safe. She left the room, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and anticipation. She contacted Marco, relaying the information, giving him the location of Giovanni Rossi's hiding place. She told him to gather the men, to prepare for the final assault, to end this nightmare once and for all. She made her way out of the Salerno estate, unnoticed, her movements swift and silent. She rejoined Marco and the other loyal Vitali men, her heart filled with a fierce determination. They drove to the old factory, their destination clear, their purpose unwavering. They were a force forged in fire, a love tested by betrayal, a bond strengthened by adversity. They were ready to confront Giovanni Rossi, to end his reign of terror, to avenge the deaths of their loved ones, to secure their future. As they approached the factory, Katerina looked at Marco, her gaze resolute. "We do this together," she said. "For Enzo. For us. For our future." The love forged in fire was about to be tested one last time. And Katerina, the once timid bride, was ready to fight, to protect, to conquer. The factory loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky, a symbol of the past and a harbinger of the future. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm. The old factory stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, a decaying monument to a bygone era of industry, now a lair for shadows and secrets. The air hung heavy with the scent of salt, rust, and the lingering ghosts of past violence. This was where it all began, Enzo had said, and Katerina knew, with chilling certainty, that this was where it would all end. Enzo, still weak but driven by a burning need for vengeance and justice, had insisted on joining them. He refused to remain behind, to let others fight his battles. Katerina, though fearful for his safety, understood his need to be present, to confront his past, to face the man who had orchestrated so much pain and destruction. Marco, ever the loyal lieutenant, had organized their forces meticulously. They were outnumbered, but they were prepared, armed, and fueled by a righteous anger that burned brighter than any fear. They approached the factory cautiously, their movements synchronized, their communication silent and efficient. Katerina stayed close to Enzo, her hand resting on his arm, her presence a constant source of strength and reassurance. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a predator ready to strike. But she also saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the lingering pain of his wounds, both physical and emotional. They breached the factory perimeter silently, slipping through a broken fence, their footsteps muffled by the overgrown weeds and crumbling concrete. The factory loomed before them, a vast, dark labyrinth of decaying machinery, broken windows, and shadowy corridors. They moved through the factory cautiously, their guns raised, their senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creaking of metal, the dripping of water, and the distant cry of seagulls. They encountered pockets of resistance, small groups of Giovanni Rossi's men, guarding the perimeter, patrolling the corridors. Brief, intense firefights erupted, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the cavernous space, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Katerina stayed close to Enzo, her own weapon drawn, her fear tempered by a fierce determination to protect him, to fight alongside him. She had never fired a gun before, but she had practiced, Marco had taught her, and she was ready to defend herself, to defend the man she loved. They pushed deeper into the factory, their objective clear, to find Giovanni Rossi, to confront him, to end his reign of terror. They followed the trail of clues, the signs of his presence, the echoes of his past. They finally reached the heart of the factory, a vast, open space where the main machinery had once stood. Now, it was a desolate arena, a stage set for the final confrontation. And there he was, Giovanni Rossi. He stood in the center of the space, surrounded by his remaining men, his face a mask of cold, calculating cruelty. He was older than Katerina had imagined, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes filled with a chilling emptiness. He looked like Enzo. The resemblance was uncanny, disturbing, a twisted reflection of the man she loved. Enzo, Giovanni said, his voice echoing through the vast space, "You came. I knew you would." Enzo stepped forward, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with a cold, controlled rage. "Giovanni," he said, "it ends here. It ends now." Giovanni laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think so?"
he said.
"You think you can defeat me? You are weak. You are wounded. You are nothing." He gestured towards Katerina. "And you brought your wife," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How touching. How foolish." Katerina stepped forward, her gaze meeting Giovanni's, her voice firm and resolute. "We are not afraid of you," she said. "We will stop you. We will end this." Giovanni's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Brave words," he said, "but empty. You don't understand. You don't know the truth." He paused, his gaze shifting between Enzo and Katerina. "I am not your enemy," he said, his voice low and intense. "I am your family. I am your brother, Enzo." Enzo stared at him, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You lie," he said, his voice trembling. "You are nothing to me." Giovanni shook his head. "I am Salvatore Rossi's son," he said. His true son. The son he disowned. The son he tried to erase. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on Enzo's. "He feared me," he said. "He knew I was stronger. He knew I would take what was rightfully mine." He paused, his gaze shifting to Katerina. "And you," he said, "you were the key to everything. The bridge between the families. The means to my revenge." Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now. Giovanni's plan, his elaborate conspiracy, had been driven by a twisted sense of family, a desire for revenge, a hunger for power. He had used her, manipulated her, played her like a pawn in his deadly game. Enzo's face was pale, his hands were shaking, but he remained silent, his eyes fixated on this man claiming to be his brother. "He set it all up," Giovanni continued, the he soaked with venom.
Salvatore.
He sent me away, but I returned. He killed your father, and then framed your death on Salerno to start a war, using me as the excuse to force the families to destroy each other, all while planning to sweep in and take it all. Isabella was the messenger, and she was supposed to eliminate you, to remove the only obstacle. But she loved me. She could never. So I had to finish the job myself. The storm that had been gathering for so long finally broke. The truth, twisted and ugly, was revealed. Enzo's past, Caterina's present, all intertwined in Giovanni's web of vengeance. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of those present. The final confrontation was at hand, and the outcome was far from certain. Chapter 18. Redemption's Embrace. Giovanni's revelation hung in the air, a poisonous cloud that threatened to suffocate them all. Enzo stared at him, his mind reeling, struggling to reconcile the horrific truth with the reality he had always known. Caterina, her heart aching for Enzo, watched the two men, the twisted reflections of each other, locked in a silent battle of wills. "You lie," Enzo repeated, but his voice lacked conviction, the certainty of his previous denials replaced by a chilling doubt. Giovanni smiled, a cruel, knowing smile.
Doi, he said.
"Ask Sophia. She knows the truth. She helped me. She hid me. She protected me. All these years." He paused, his gaze shifting to Caterina. "And you, my dear," he said, "you played your part perfectly. The grieving widow, the trusting bride, the perfect pawn." Caterina felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to refute his words, to prove him wrong. "I am not your pawn," she said, her voice firm and resolute.
I chose Enzo.
"I chose love."
I chose loyalty.
Giovanni laughed, a mocking sound that echoed through the vast space. "Love?"
He scoffed.
"Loyalty? Those are weaknesses. Illusions. They mean nothing." He raised his hand, signaling his men. They stepped forward, their guns raised, ready to fire. "It's over, Enzo," Giovanni said. "You lose. I win. The Vitali family ends here. And the Rossi legacy will rise again." Enzo stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, his body tensing, ready to fight. He may have been wounded, he may have been outnumbered, but he would not surrender. He would not let Giovanni win. "It's not over," Enzo said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's never over. Until I say it is." He looked at Caterina, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and apology. "I am sorry," he whispered, "for everything. For bringing you into this mess." Caterina shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "Don't," she said. "I chose this. I chose you, and I would do it again." She stepped forward, standing beside him, her hand reaching for his. They stood together, a united front, facing the enemy, their love a shield against the darkness. Before Giovanni could give the order to fire, Marco and the remaining loyal Vitali men launched their attack. They had been waiting for the signal, for the opportune moment, and now they struck with swift, decisive force. The factory erupted in chaos, a maelstrom of gunfire, shouts, and screams. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood. Caterina, caught in the crossfire, stayed close to Enzo, her body shielding his, her own weapon drawn, ready to defend him, to defend their love. Enzo, despite his wounds, fought with a fierce determination, his movements precise and deadly. He was a force of nature, a man driven by a righteous anger, a burning need for justice. The battle raged, a brutal, chaotic struggle for survival. Men fell, lives were lost, the factory floor stained with blood. Caterina, caught in the midst of the violence, found herself face to face with Giovanni. He lunged at her, his eyes filled with hatred, his intent clear: to kill her, to eliminate the final obstacle to his victory. She reacted instinctively, raising her gun, firing. The bullet struck him, knocking him back, but it wasn't a fatal wound. He staggered, his face contorted with pain and rage, but he remained standing. He raised his own gun, aiming it at Katerina, his finger tightening on the trigger. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impact, for the end. But the shot never came. She opened her eyes to see Enzo standing between her and Giovanni, his body shielding hers, his own gun pointed at Giovanni's heart. "It's over, Giovanni," Enzo said, his voice cold and resolute. "It ends now." Giovanni stared at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and defeat. He knew that he had lost, that his grand plan, his lifelong quest for revenge, had failed. He lowered his gun, his body slumping, his spirit broken. "You were always stronger," he whispered, his voice barely audible.
Enzo didn't fire.
He couldn't. Despite everything, Giovanni was still family. He couldn't bring himself to kill his own brother, even a brother twisted by hatred and betrayal. He lowered his own gun, his body trembling with the effort to restrain his rage, to choose mercy over vengeance. Marco and the other Vitali men secured the remaining enemy combatants, disarming them, taking them prisoner. The battle was over. The victory was theirs, but it was a victory stained with blood, with loss, with the bitter taste of betrayal. Enzo turned to Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and love. He reached out and took her hand, his grip tight and reassuring. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's finally over." Katerina nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She leaned against him, her body trembling, her heart overflowing with a mixture of grief, relief, and love. They had survived. They had faced the darkness. They had confronted the betrayal. They had emerged victorious. Their love, forged in fire, had been tested to its limits, and it had endured. The long, dark night was finally over. The dawn was breaking, casting a golden light over the ravaged factory, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. Enzo, finally acknowledging the deep-seated trauma of his past, embraced the opportunity for healing. He sought therapy, started to dismantle the toxic traditions of the famiglia, and began to build a life based on trust and respect, rather than fear and violence. Katerina, her strength and resilience revealed, stood by his side, her love a constant source of support and inspiration. She helped him to heal, to forgive, to move forward. The price of loyalty had been high, but they had paid it. And in doing so, they had found redemption. They had found peace. They had found a love that would last a lifetime. The factory, a symbol of destruction, would become a place of new beginnings, a reminder that even from the ashes of the past, something beautiful could grow. The sun rose, painting the sky with vibrant colors, a promise of a brighter future. Chapter 19. Crossroads of Destiny. The weeks following the confrontation at the factory were a time of profound healing and transformation. Enzo, with Katerina's unwavering support, embarked on a journey of self-discovery, confronting the demons of his past and dismantling the destructive legacy of the Vitali and Rossi families. He initiated a series of bold reforms, breaking with the traditional omerta, reaching out to law enforcement, and cooperating with investigations into the criminal activities of both families. He offered amnesty to those who were willing to renounce violence and embrace a new way of life. He invested in community projects, creating jobs, supporting education, and fostering a sense of hope and opportunity in the neighborhoods that had long been under the grip of organized crime. His actions were met with resistance, with skepticism, with outright hostility from some quarters. There were those who clung to the old ways, who saw his reforms as a betrayal, a sign of weakness. But Enzo persevered, driven by a newfound sense of purpose, a commitment to building a better future for himself, for Katerina, and for the community he had once ruled through fear. Katerina, her strength and resilience proven time and again, played a crucial role in this transformation. She was his confidant, his advisor, his partner in every sense of the word. She helped him to navigate the complex web of relationships, to build bridges with former enemies, to forge alliances with those who shared his vision of a more peaceful and prosperous future. She also embarked on her own journey of self-discovery, exploring her own talents and passions, finding her own voice in a world that had long silenced her. She became involved in local charities, supporting women and children who had been victims of violence and abuse. She rediscovered her love of art, taking painting classes, expressing her emotions, her experiences, through the vibrant colors and bold strokes of her brush. Their relationship deepened, their love strengthened by the shared challenges they had overcome, the shared vision they had embraced. They found solace in each other's arms, their connection a beacon of hope in a world that had long been shrouded in darkness. One evening, as they were walking in the garden of the Vitali estate, the same garden where their love had first blossomed, Enzo stopped and turned to Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotion and resolve. "Katerina," he said, his voice husky, I have been thinking about our future, about what we want, for ourselves, for our lives." Katerina looked at him, her heart filled with a quiet anticipation. She knew that he was on the verge of a significant decision, a choice that would shape their destiny. I want to leave this life," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to step away. From the famiglia. From the violence. From the past." Katerina's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and relief. She had hoped for this. She had dreamed of this, but she had never dared to believe it was possible. "And what will you do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that transformed his face. I want to live," he said. "I want to travel. I want to see the world. With you." He paused, his gaze searching hers. I want to build a new life. A different life. A life free from fear. Free from secrets. Free from the shadows. Katerina's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, tears of gratitude, tears of love. She reached out and took his hand, her grip tight and reassuring. "Yes," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "Yes. I want that too. I want that with you." They embraced, their bodies melting together, their hearts beating as one. It was a moment of profound connection, of shared dreams, of a future filled with hope and possibility. But their path forward was not without its obstacles. There were legal hurdles to overcome, arrangements to be made, loose ends to be tied up. Enzo had to cooperate with the authorities, provide evidence, testify against former associates. He had to face the consequences of his past actions, the risks of retaliation, the uncertainty of a new life. They faced a crucial crossroads, a decision that would determine the course of their future. They could choose to remain in Naples, to continue the work of reforming the famiglia, to build a new legacy from the ashes of the old. Or they could choose to leave, to start anew, to embrace a life of freedom and anonymity, far from the shadows of their past. They discussed their options, weighing the pros and cons, considering the risks and rewards. They sought advice from trusted friends, from legal experts, from spiritual advisors. Finally, they made their decision. It was a bold decision, a courageous decision, a decision driven by their love for each other, their desire for a better future. They decided to leave. They would sell the Vitali estate, sever their ties with the famiglia, and embark on a new adventure, a journey of self-discovery, a life lived on their own terms. They knew that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges, that there would be moments of doubt, of fear, of regret. But they were ready. They were strong. They were together. As they prepared for their departure, Katerina found herself reflecting on her journey, on the transformation she had undergone. She had arrived in Naples a timid, submissive bride, a pawn in a deadly game. She had faced betrayal, violence, and loss. But she had also found strength, courage, and love. She had discovered her own voice, her own purpose, her own destiny. She was no longer the capo's bride. She was Katerina Vitali, a woman of resilience, a woman of passion, a woman of freedom. And as she stood on the threshold of a new life, with the man she loved by her side, she knew that anything was possible. The crossroads had been reached, and they had chosen their path. A path leading away from the darkness, towards the light. A path paved with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. The open road and all its uncertainties awaited. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The decision to leave Naples, to sever ties with the Famiglia, was not without its repercussions. News of Enzo's intended departure spread quickly, creating ripples of shock, disbelief, and anger throughout the underworld. There were those who saw it as a betrayal, a sign of weakness, a violation of the sacred code of Omerta. Among the most vocal opponents was Don Carlo Salerno, still reeling from the loss of his son, Marco, and the exposure of Giovanni Rossi's conspiracy. He saw Enzo's departure as an opportunity, a chance to reclaim power, to reassert his dominance, to avenge the wrongs he believed had been committed against him. He summoned a meeting of the remaining Famiglia heads, a clandestine gathering held in a remote, heavily guarded location. He presented his case, his arguments, his demands. He called for Enzo's assassination, a swift and brutal end to the Vitali legacy. But his call for vengeance was not universally embraced. There were those who had grown weary of the violence, the endless cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. There were those who saw Enzo's reforms as a positive step, a chance for a more peaceful and prosperous future. The meeting was tense, fraught with conflict, the air thick with unspoken threats and simmering resentments. The old guard, clinging to tradition, clashed with the new generation, yearning for change. Meanwhile, Enzo and Caterina were making their final preparations for departure. They had sold the Vitali estate, transferred their assets, and secured new identities. They had chosen a remote destination, a peaceful haven far from the reach of the Italian underworld. They were scheduled to leave within days, their bags packed, their tickets purchased, their hearts filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. But their plans were disrupted by an unexpected summons. A message arrived, delivered by a trusted intermediary, requesting a meeting with Don Carlo Salerno. The message was cryptic, veiled in secrecy, but the underlying threat was clear. Enzo knew that it was a trap, a ploy to lure him into a vulnerable position, to assassinate him before he could escape. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't leave without confronting Salerno one last time, without resolving the lingering tensions, without securing a measure of peace for those he was leaving behind. Caterina pleaded with him not to go, to disregard the summons, to prioritize their safety, their future. But Enzo was adamant. He had to face his past, he had to confront his demons, he had to do what he believed was right. I have to go, he said, his voice firm and resolute. I cannot run. I cannot hide. I have to end this. Once and for all. Caterina, though fearful for his safety, understood his need to confront Salerno, to seek closure, to secure a measure of peace for the future. She knew that she couldn't stop him, that she had to trust him, that she had to support him, even in this final, dangerous confrontation. They agreed to meet Salerno at a neutral location, a small, abandoned church on the outskirts of Naples. It was a place steeped in history, a symbol of faith and redemption, a fitting setting for the final reckoning. Enzo and Caterina arrived at the church, accompanied by Marco and a small contingent of loyal men. They were heavily armed, prepared for the worst, but hoping for a peaceful resolution. Salerno was already there, waiting for them, surrounded by his own heavily armed guards. The atmosphere was tense, charged with animosity, the air thick with unspoken threats. Enzo and Salerno faced each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. They were two men from different worlds, bound by a shared history of violence and betrayal, their destinies intertwined. Enzo, Salerno said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. You disappoint me. You betray your family. You betray your heritage. You betray me. Enzo stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. I betray nothing, he said, his voice firm and resolute. I choose a different path. A path of peace. A path of redemption. Salerno scoffed, a mocking sound. Peace? He said. Redemption? There is no peace. There is no redemption. Only power. Only revenge. He raised his hand, signaling his men. They stepped forward, their guns raised, ready to fire. "It ends here," Enzo Salerno said.
UD.
"And the Vitali legacy dies with you." Katerina stepped forward, placing herself between Enzo and Salerno, her body shielding his, her voice ringing out with defiance.
No.
She cried. "This ends now. The violence stops. The killing stops. We choose a different way." Salerno looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "You dare," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You dare to interfere. You are nothing. A woman. A outsider." Katerina stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I am his wife," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I am his partner. I am his equal. And I will not let you harm him." Her words, her courage, her unwavering loyalty created a moment of stunned silence. Salerno's men hesitated, their resolve wavering. Even Salerno himself seemed taken aback by her defiance. Enzo stepped forward, placing his hand on Katerina's shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "Katerina," he said, his voice filled with love and gratitude. "Thank you. But this is my fight." He turned to Salerno, his eyes blazing with a newfound determination. "Salerno," he said, "I offer you a choice. We can end this here. We can walk away. We can choose peace. Or we can continue this cycle of violence, this endless blood feud, until we destroy each other." Salerno stared at him, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing his options, considering the consequences of his actions. The tension in the church was palpable, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of those present. The fate of two families, the future of a city, hung in the balance. Finally, Salerno spoke, his voice low and measured. "I choose peace," he said. His words were unexpected, a stunning reversal, a moment of profound transformation. He lowered his hand, signaling his men to stand down. "I am tired," he said, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "Tired of the violence. Tired of the killing. Tired of the hatred." He looked at Enzo, his eyes filled with a grudging respect. "You are a different man, Enzo," he said. "You have changed. You have chosen a different path." He paused, his gaze shifting to Katerina. "And you," he said, "you are a remarkable woman. You have shown me that there is another way." He extended his hand to Enzo, a gesture of reconciliation, a symbol of peace. Enzo hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. They shook hands, their grip firm, their eyes meeting. It was a moment of profound significance, a turning point in their history, a final confrontation that ended not in bloodshed, but in a fragile, tentative truce. The hearts and loyalties that had been tested, broken, and betrayed were, in that moment, offered a chance at healing. The final confrontation had yielded not victory or defeat, but a path towards a new beginning. The storm had passed, and the sun, though obscured by lingering clouds, began to shine through. Enzo, Katerina, Marco, and the loyal Vitali men, with a silent, heavy nod of agreement, and much to the surprise of Salerno's guards, left. Epilogue. The jets soared above the clouds, leaving behind the sprawling cityscape of Naples, the shimmering bay, and the looming shadow of Vesuvius. Katerina looked out the window, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. She was leaving behind a life of violence, of secrets, of constant fear, but she was also leaving behind a part of herself, a part of her history. Enzo, seated beside her, reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. He understood her conflicted emotions, her bittersweet farewell to a world that had both shaped and scarred her. "It's a new beginning, Katerina," he said, his voice soft and filled with hope. "A fresh start. A chance to build a different life. Together." She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reflected the peace she felt within. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her body relaxing, her spirit soaring. They had chosen a remote island in the Pacific, a secluded paradise far from the reach of the Italian underworld, as their new home. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, of pristine beaches, of lush tropical forests, of crystal-clear waters. It was a place where they could heal, where they could reconnect, where they could rediscover themselves, free from the burdens of their past. They spent their days exploring the island, swimming in the turquoise waters, hiking through the verdant hills, discovering hidden waterfalls and secluded coves. They learned the local customs, the language, the traditions of the islanders, embracing a simpler, more authentic way of life. Enzo, freed from the constraints of the famiglia, rediscovered his passion for art. He set up a studio in their small, charming cottage, overlooking the ocean. He painted with a newfound freedom, his canvases filled with vibrant colors, bold strokes, and the raw beauty of their surroundings. Katerina, her own creative spirit awakened, continued to paint, her art reflecting her journey of self-discovery, her resilience, her love for Enzo. She also became involved in the local community, teaching art classes to children, volunteering at a local women's shelter, sharing her strength and compassion with those in need. Their relationship blossomed, their love deepened by the shared experiences, the challenges overcome, the new life they were building together. They found a peace they had never known before, a tranquility that soothed their souls, a happiness that filled their days. They often thought of their past, of the friends and family they had left behind, of the lives lost, of the sacrifices made. But they didn't dwell on the darkness. They didn't let the shadows consume them. They focused on the future, on the hope, on the possibility of a better world. One evening, as they were sitting on the beach, watching the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky with vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple, Enzo turned to Katerina, his eyes filled with a love that had transcended time, distance, and adversity. "Katerina," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I never thought I could be this happy. I never thought I deserved this love. You changed everything. You saved me." Katerina smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy.
"And you saved me, Enzo," she said.
"You showed me that I was strong, that I was worthy, that I could love and be loved." They embraced, their bodies melting together, their hearts beating as one. The ocean breeze whispered around them, carrying the scent of salt and flowers, the sound of waves lapping gently against the shore. They had found their paradise, their sanctuary, their forever. They had escaped the shadows of their past. They had embraced the light of their future. They had found a love that was stronger than any fear, any betrayal, any obstacle. And as they stood there, together, on the edge of the world, they knew that their journey had just begun. A journey of love, of healing, of redemption. A journey that would last a lifetime. The stars emerged, twinkling like diamonds scattered across the velvet sky, a silent witness to their enduring love.
The end.